It was the summer of 1943 when the Germans and Soviets faced each other in a fierce fight near a place called Kursk. The Germans had a risky plan called Operation Citadel, and even Hitler was worried about it. He said, "Whenever I think of this assault, my stomach turns over." The Germans had a bulge of land in Kursk because of the Soviets' advances after the Battle of Stalingrad. So, they wanted to attack from the north and south to surround the Russian troops in that bulge. This way, they could have a shorter front line. To make their plan work, the Germans devoted about 70% of their tanks and almost 2/3 of their planes to this attack. But they had a tough challenge because they needed more soldiers to have a better chance at winning. However, in Kursk, they found themselves having fewer soldiers than the defenders. The Germans believed in their new tanks like Panthers, Tigers, and Ferdinands. They thought these tanks would be powerful enough to break through the Russian defenses and help their other tanks advance. But the Soviets were ready for them. The Germans had always wanted to attack the bulge in Kursk, and the Soviets knew about it thanks to their allies. Hitler decided to wait a bit before attacking, so the new German tanks could join the army. But the Russians didn't waste this time. They built strong defenses that were hard to break through. The Germans had to go through anti-tank ditches, minefields, and barbed wire. The Russians had set up 25,000 anti-tank guns in the area to stop the Germans. They placed anti-tank guns every 10 meters in critical spots. The Germans started attacking on July 5th, but the Russians knew they were coming and bombed them before they could start, making it hard for the Germans to move forward. The German heavy tanks, especially the Tiger one, were tough and could resist the Soviet anti-tank guns. But their tracks were vulnerable to anti-tank mines. The Soviet soldiers were clever. They put spare mines in the path of the attackers and used grenades, Molotov cocktails, and explosives against the German tanks. The Ferdinand tanks were in trouble too because they didn't have a machine gun on their hull, so they couldn't defend themselves well against these attacks. The weather on the battlefield was tough, with scorching heat and pouring rain. Inside the tanks, the crew felt exhausted from the heat while loading heavy shells into the tank guns. Many Germans were tired, so they used a pill called Pervitin, or tank chocolate, which had methamphetamine to help them fight fatigue and feel more confident. Over 200 million of these pills were given to soldiers during the war. After 4 days of fighting, the German attack from the north, led by Field Marshal Walter Model, started to slow down. They caused a lot of damage to the Russians and destroyed hundreds of their tanks, but they couldn't overcome the large number of Soviet soldiers and tanks. In the south, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's forces had similar problems, but they gained momentum after a slow start. On July 7th, it looked like they might break through the main Russian defense, but the Soviets sent more troops to stop them. Even so, the Germans kept trying, and by July 11th, the elite 2 SS Panzer Corps armored divisions reached the outskirts of a small town called Prokhorovka, about 50 miles from Kursk. While the Germans were resting and preparing to attack Prokhorovka, they heard a frightening sound, the rumble of hundreds of tank engines. The Russians were getting ready to counterattack. The next day, one of the biggest tank battles in history happened. Over 800 armored vehicles clashed at close range. The Russians fought this way because they thought it would cancel out the German tanks' advantage in long-range combat. General Rotmistrov, the commander of the Russian 5th Guards tank army, gave the order, "Stal, Stal, Stal," and 600 Russian tanks charged at the Germans. The battle turned into chaos, with tanks burning everywhere and no clear command. Some tanks even crashed into each other, and explosions sent turrets flying into the air. By the end of the day, the battlefield was full of destroyed tanks, and the Germans lost around 200, while the Russians lost more but remained undefeated. The next day, Hitler decided to stop Operation Citadel. At the same time, the Russians attacked in the north of Kursk, and with news of the Allies' invasion of Sicily, Hitler had to send troops to defend Italy. The German forces were tired and facing bad circumstances, so they had to retreat. In just 2.5 months, they withdrew 150 miles along a 650-mile front. The big German gamble had failed. The Soviets kept pushing them back because they had more soldiers. The next summer, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, a big attack in Belarusia, and the German front collapsed. In just 5 weeks, the Soviets advanced over 435 miles and reached the outskirts of Warsaw. 8 months later, they were at the doorstep of Berlin.